I'm Neil Doherty with North Country Whitetails, and welcome to DSI. You know, for years you've been reading about big bucks and some of the stories behind how they're harvested, but you never really got a full picture. In DSI, we're going to break it down in great detail and really give you the behind-the-scenes talk and understanding why deer do what they do. We're going to merge the deer stories with the science behind how the deer move, the food sources in the area, get up above and study aerial photography and really teach you how to use those techniques when it comes to your hunts this fall. This is a story of the Big Ten and how Jim harvested them. Now, before we get into Jim's story, let's take a look at the overall farm. It's a 300-acre farm that had been managed for the last 3 years. It had been managed for a mature buck, 4-year-old bucks or older, and really was starting to pay off the year that Jim was able to encounter the Big Ten. Several areas of food plots have been planted. There was standing corn that was planted and left on the western side of the farm, as well as a brassica mix on the south side of the corn, and some whitetail institute clover down along this ridge line in a small half-acre field. More corn, more clover, more brassica was planted on another large destination field complex on the eastern side of the farm. And these two complexes really started to gather up deer from the sanctuaries that were on the property. There were 2 main sanctuaries. Now these areas had been heavily cut, and they were also old abandoned farm fields, so they were naturally thick. A large 30-acre sanctuary was located on the south side of the farm, as well as a central sanctuary was located in the middle of the property that was dominated by a hemlock stand that had been recently thinned so that the sunlight would reach the ground, offering thick regeneration for deer that were bedding in there. 2 main features that really distinguish this property and make it into a unique hunting property and kind of actually ultimately changed the way that this Big Ten moved around the property. First of all, it borders up along a 4-lane. This 4-lane, although it's noisy on the property, is a tremendous funnel. During the rut, bucks will drop down and parallel this 4-lane 40 yards off the highway fence, and they're back and forth, a lot of traffic there. It also limits the exposure from trespassing from people coming in on that side, so it's a nice buffer zone. There's 2 very deep, very pronounced ravines that are on the property as well. Coming off the 4-lane in a northerly direction, there's a deep ravine here, several hundred feet deep. On the south side of the property, there's also another deep ravine. These terrain features create some incredible funnels that during the rut, the bucks will lock into in parallel as they move through the property. So let's get to know this Big Ten and how Jim was able to pull it off. He first showed up in October on his first round of cameras that he had put out on basically mapping out the large destination fields and a small hunting food plot that was located down along the highway. First series of photos of the buck were passing through this small little half-acre field that bordered up along a very deep ravine. And by the frequency of the amount of time the buck was photographed there, it really was a natural location to try to catch the buck. The season started, it was during the pre-rut period of time. There was very little activity of buck cruising, but as the rut started to increase in activity and kind of hit the frenzied pace of the middle of November, the buck really was on his feet a lot. And when he cruised, he would cruise along the edge of the highway and then just cut the corner here as he headed up and around the ravine. The food plot was actually a man-made opening pushed in place to help drag the deer a little bit closer to the edge of the ravine. Keep in mind, the buck naturally would want to walk on kind of a line a little bit further west of the ravine than what happened after the food plot was put in place. The food plot, by creating that food reward in that location, helped pull him a little bit closer to the ravine and made it a lot easier for the hunter to set up on the edge of the ravine, let his scent drift into the ravine on a westerly wind, and be able to leave without disturbing the deer. Again, low pressure scenario hunting. Middle of November, while the buck was cruising, Jim actually got a shooting opportunity on this buck and was able to shoot, and he made a poor hit. He hit the buck a little bit high, tracked the buck all the way throughout the farm, and was not able to come up with a deer. It was absolutely heartbroken. Later on that night, after he made that hit, he had a series of photos of the buck as it passed through another small food plot, obviously unaffected, still chasing does, and that was an encouraging sign. So fast forward through the fall hunting season, off and on, he's still catching pictures or glimpses of this buck as he's moving around. Now the trick with a farm like this is to stay put. When he would glimpse this buck, when the buck was rutting hard and cruising chasing does, when he glimpsed him in a pocket on one corridor of the property, the temptation was, okay, you saw him in the morning, was to go back in that same pocket that evening and try to intercept the buck. The reality was, as the buck was cruising through the property, he was marking that off. As I checked it, there wasn't a hot doe there. So that evening, rather than being back where you saw him in the morning, he was likely to be on the other side of the farm checking another corridor, almost like a grid search for the piece of property. Jim spent quite a bit of time during the bow season chasing the buck in spots where he had just been until he transitioned out of that and started to stay put and let the buck come to him. And that's really important on a farm like this that has good funnels. If you just sit it out, sooner or later that buck will check the grid or check the corridor that you're in and you'll get the shot that you're looking for. As gun season approached, he wasn't able to see the deer. The first couple days of the season, did get a glimpse of him during a snowstorm, so he knew he was still around. I had to go back to work for a couple of weeks and was able to return about the third week of gun season. So it had been quite a bit of time, and the buck was still on the farm. He had another picture of him, so he knew he was still there. From his maiden shooting house on a northwest wind, he spotted the buck coming out of one of the bedding sanctuaries, drifting up into the cornfield and started feeding the corn. And it was during a cold, extended period of weather, so the buck was really trying to repair his body, probably some from the wound that he received earlier, but also he was a rutting buck, so he was worn down and beat up. Buck fed for actually about 45 minutes in the field. I know Jim well. He actually texted me and let me know the buck was in the field. He was so excited to see him. It's a shotgun hunting only area, and it wasn't within reach of his tree stand, so he couldn't connect with a shot. He put together a plan of moving the stand location up a little bit closer, and actually kind of a bare bones stand approach, slipped up the edge of the field the next day early in the afternoon, sat down in a 5-gallon pail, threw a white sheet over top of himself. Again, keep in mind there was snow on the ground, and just hunted with his head exposed and using a sheet like a poncho, just hunkered down in the hedgerow. Again, that's a great approach if you're trying not to disturb deer. Just hunker down close enough that you can get a shot. Don't go through all the trouble of rigging a stand and making all the noise and clanking and banging. You're probably going to bump the deer because during the late season they're bedded awful close to the food source. Same northwest wind, and actually that night the buck did not show up. And I visited with Jim that evening and told him to stay the course, give him one more shift there before he tried him on another portion of the farm. The following evening, he moved back up along the edge of the field again, got situated up in the corner on his 5-gallon pail with his white sheet on, and several deer showed up early. The deer were on the feet and on the feed a little bit earlier that night, and the buck came along and actually gave him a shot about 12 yards directly behind him. He had to shoot the deer left-handed, so that was quite a feat for him to be able to pull that off. He made a good shot of the deer, was able to connect on a dynamite deer. Now, when you're hunting in this type of scenario and you have funnels, the trick is to put your time in and really wait for those deer to come to you, and don't spend a lot of time skipping around the woods and chasing sightings or chasing camera photos of the deer. If he's using the farm, sooner or later he'll show up in your grid and you'll get the shot that you're looking for.